COVID outbreaks on cruise ships are usually massive front page news. However, two COVID incidents on large cruise ships in Europe have, in the past weeks, largely been ignored. I'm Gary Bembridge, and I'm going to look at what happened, why you likely didn't hear about them, and most important of all, why I think both of these have really big implications for cruising and for us as cruise passengers. First off, what are the two incidents? Well, in February, the TUI Cruises and Royal Caribbean joint venture Mein Schiff, on their Mein Schiff 2, which had 1,000 passengers and 800 crew on board, they discovered some COVID positive passengers on one of their Canary Island cruises. 4 guests actually tested positive for COVID-19, and 9 guests and 11 crew members were identified as persons who had come in close contact with those passengers through their contact tracing process on board. So all passengers and all the crew were then tested, and they were all found to be negative before they were allowed to finish their cruise and eventually disembark and return home to Germany. Those in close contact and those infected were then isolated initially on the ship, and then they went into hotel quarantine in the Canary Islands at Mein Schiff's expense to basically run through that whole process. The second incident was not much later on MSC Grandiosa on one of their 7-night cruises out of Genoa. Now, a passenger on this ship tested positive, and they were picked up in the regular processes and screening on board the ship, while his wife eventually tested negative. Again, the close contacts of the couple were identified using onboard contact tracing, which in the case of MSC includes a wearable device, use of CCTV and face recognition, and regular swiping of cruise cards in and out of different venues. So all of those guests who were identified as being close contacts were isolated and tested, and they were all negative. Now, the MSC cruise protocols say that when there is a positive case of COVID-19 on board, those infected, they get transferred to a land-based facility as soon as possible. And these are ones that the cruise line had established and negotiated deals with to have isolation and medical arrangements. It was all done as part of their return to sail planning. So based on this protocol, MSC, they made a short technical call on the port of Palermo, and they transferred the guest and his wife to one of those facilities. And again, everyone was tested negative, so the cruise resumed, and the unaffected guests, they basically continued as normal. They're all tested, as I said, that they were negative. Now, these incidents, both these incidents, and how they play out tells us a couple of really, really important things with big implications as we look at cruising returning in the United States, in the UK, in Spain, Australia, and so on. First, although coverage may have been pretty much non-existent in English-speaking media because there were no US or UK guests involved, I do hope, and I really do believe, that it shows the start of media getting a much better perspective and a clearer understanding of what the cruise industry actually now has in place to minimize COVID-19 coming on board, identifying it if it does come on board, and managing the whole process without having to lock down the entire cruise, put all the passengers in quarantining, basically lock down and isolate the ship. Now, in the context of what has, and in fact is still happening on land, it makes these two COVID events on ships and how they were managed look so much more ordered, so much more controlled, and extremely thorough, because in both cases there was not a big dramatic story to tell, which of course is why it may also have been ignored by the media, because the story here is that the protocols spotted the issue through onboard testing capability and processes. Contact tracing meant those at risk were quickly identified and quarantined. Those that were positive entered very specific cruise line funded facilities, and the cruise was able to continue with everyone who's not affected. Not the dramatic saga that media like when it comes to cruising, you could of course argue. Secondly, which is key to this incident, while testing can of course minimize the risk of COVID coming on board, I think everyone accepts that it's realistically going to be impossible to stop COVID coming onto ships, as it is to stop it coming into events or premises on land. So the key here is how it gets managed. The protocols on Mein Schiff and MSC Cruises meant, 1, they have testing of all passengers and all crew before the cruise, before boarding, to minimize the risk of it coming on board. 2, they are then able to identify suspected infected guests who may not have been picked up in that pre-board testing for whatever reason through the onboard ongoing, constant, everyday screening. 3, they're then able to confirm the issue with onboard testing capability, which is right there now installed on the ship. 4, through active contact tracing, which, as I mentioned, involves a lot of technology, and they know exactly who the close contacts were, so they're able to focus and isolate only on those people. So in the case of Mein Schiff, that was around 20 people, and it was actually much fewer for MSC Grandiosa. They don't have to disrupt and lock down everybody on the whole ship. 5thly, they can then remove the infected guests into pre-agreed medical and isolation facilities on land, so away from the ship. And then 6th, they can use the process, again agreed with local health authorities, to test and make sure that everyone else is clear. They can let the cruise continue. And finally, of course, for travelers to disembark as planned from the trip and head home. It's a process covering all stages. Now, despite some well-documented missteps by Hurtigruten and Sea Dream, the cruise industry has, from many sailings in summer, increasingly proven, real-life tested and constantly fine-tuned these protocols and these processes to minimize, identify, contain and manage issues and outbreaks. This process is in place not only for Mein Schiff and MSC Cruises, but other lines sailing in Europe. So you've got lines like Hapag-Lloyd, Costa Cruises, and then you've got those across in Asia, like Royal Caribbean, Continent of the Seas, and Dream Cruises, and those in Japan, and so on. It shows an end-to-end process to identify, contain, and manage COVID when cruising. And also, guests seem to be happy with them, they understand them, and they appreciate what it's doing to make this process much more containable. So Richard Fain, chairman of the Royal Caribbean Group, talking about the Singapore sailing specifically, and has now been extended to the middle of the year, he said, I'm going to quote, it's quite important what he said, "Guests are sharing very positive reviews, and we're also seeing a higher proportion of first-time cruises than expected. We believe that these cruises, even before the availability of vaccines, are helping us learn and demonstrate to others how we can operate successfully under the current COVID-19 environment." For me, one of the key achievements of the protocols is they have shown that, unlike early 2020, when the pandemic was starting, cruise lines have now shown that the virus does not sweep the whole way through the ships. They're able to contain it. Pre-pandemic, that was just not possible. As an aside, the protocols have been so successful, they're even discussing with Singaporean officials now increasing onboard capacity from 50% to 65%. Is there risk with these? Of course, as there is on land with places where people come together and interact. However, the protocols in place are beyond what is happening and in place on land. So it looks very promising as we look at what can be achieved and what we can expect when cruising is able to resume globally, as these protocols have all formed the basis of the proposals submitted all around the world, including the United States, the UK and Australia specifically. Now, of course, some of the protocols like mask wearing, controlled line-only excursions, limits on numbers in venues, the ability to meet and dine with strangers, these are not ones that everybody's going to want to cruise with. And so the group of people will want to stay away. But for those of us who do want to cruise and are willing to accept these, there does appear to be lots of hope that we should be able to with greater confidence than ever, because these protocols are pretty much being road tested. Of course, also the accelerating rollout of vaccines will no doubt be factored into all of this too. How exactly, it's still a matter for debate, it's still unclear, but it does seem possible they are going to be included in some way, as I've covered in other episodes. So what do you think about my thoughts on what these COVID incidents and the reaction to them mean for us as cruisers? I'd love to know what you think. If you found this interesting and entertaining, I have hundreds more episodes packed full of updates, tips and advice. So why not enjoy another one right now?